The stranger rode into Clarkford on a cold March morning, when the last of winter's grip still clutched the high country, his breath and that of his horse forming white clouds in the thin air. He sat his saddle like a man who'd covered hard miles, dust and trail weariness marking him. But his eyes moved with the careful attention of someone hunting. Those eyes swept the main street, taking the general store, the saloon, the church with its modest steeple, and the scattering of folks going about their morning business. When his gaze settled on the small figure hunched over a broom outside Peterson's mercantile, something shifted in his expression. Recognition mixed with something darker. The man swept off his hat and ran weathered fingers through graying hair. "Excuse me," he called to a woman carrying a basket of laundry. "Been looking for someone." "Man goes by the name of Samuel Reed. You wouldn't know where I might find him?" The woman paused, eyeing the stranger with the wariness frontier folk reserved for armed men asking questions. "Can't say I know anyone by that name, mister. You might try asking at the saloon or the hotel." But the stranger's attention had already moved on. He was watching the figure with the broom, a thin man in patched clothes and worn boots, sweeping with the careful thoroughness of someone who needed the work. Even from a distance, there was something familiar in the way the man moved, the set of his shoulders, the way he kept his head down, but his ears alert. "Much obliged," the stranger murmured to the woman. But she was already hurrying away, sensing trouble in the wind. The man with the broom was Ezra Collins. Though few in Clarkford knew much about him, beyond the fact that he'd arrived last spring with nothing but the clothes on his back and a willingness to work for whatever folks could spare. He swept floors, chopped wood, mended fences, and asked for little beyond a meal and maybe a corner of a barn to sleep in when the weather turned harsh. Some said he was simple, others that he was just down on his luck. Most didn't think about him at all. What they didn't know was that Ezra Collins had once been Samuel Reed, and Samuel Reed had been a different man entirely, a man with property and position, a man whose name had carried weight in places far from this small mountain town. That man had made choices, trusted the wrong people, and lost everything that mattered. The transformation from Samuel Reed to Ezra Collins hadn't been born of deception, but of necessity, and of a soul so battered by loss that starting over had seemed the only path to redemption. Ezra had learned to find purpose in small acts of kindness. When Mrs. Henderson's roof leaked, he'd shown up with borrowed tools and spent a day patching it, refusing payment. When the widow Martinez's firewood ran low, he'd split and stacked a cord without being asked. The coins he earned sweeping and odd jobs. They rarely stayed in his pocket long. There was always someone who needed them more, a family short on flour, a child without shoes, an elderly man who couldn't afford medicine. The people of Clarkford saw his threadbare clothes and empty pockets and assumed he was just another drifter working for survival. They had no way of knowing that in a bank in Cheyenne, there sat an account containing more money than most of them would see in a lifetime. Money that Ezra could access with a telegram. But money he'd sworn never to touch again. That fortune had cost him his wife, his daughter, and his peace of mind. He'd rather starve than profit from it again. This morning, as Ezra swept the wooden sidewalk in front of Peterson's store, he felt the weight of being watched. Years of living carefully had honed his instincts, and something about the quality of attention focused on him made his shoulders tense. He didn't look up, but he listened to the approaching hoofbeats, the creak of leather as the rider dismounted, the deliberate footsteps on the wooden walk. "Samuel Reed," the voice said quietly. "Been a long time." Ezra's hands stilled on the broom handle. The voice belonged to Marcus Wade, and hearing it again was like having cold water thrown in his face. Slowly, he straightened and turned to face the man he'd hoped never to see again. Marcus Wade had aged hard in the years since their last meeting. His face was leaner, carved by weather and something harder than weather. His clothes were travel-stained but good quality, and the gun on his hip was worn with the easy familiarity of a man who'd had cause to use it. But it was his eyes that made Ezra's chest tighten with old fear and older guilt. They burned with the kind of pain that time hadn't touched. "Marcus," Ezra said quietly, "didn't expect to see you in these parts." "I'll bet you didn't." Marcus stepped closer, and Ezra caught the scent of whiskey and road dust and something else. The bitter smell of a man carrying a grudge, like a disease. Been looking for you for nigh on 2 years, Samuel. Or do you go by something else these days? Name's Ezra Collins now, he said simply. Samuel Reed's dead and buried. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Is that what you tell yourself? That changing your name changes what you did? His voice rose slightly, drawing glances from passers-by. That it brings back what you took from me? Ezra glanced around, noting the growing attention. Mrs. Peterson had appeared in the doorway of the mercantile, and across the street, several men had paused their conversation to watch. The last thing he wanted was to bring his past troubles down on these people who'd shown him kindness. This isn't the place, Marcus, he said quietly. You want to talk, we can... Don't you tell me where and when. Marcus snapped, his hand dropping unconsciously toward his gun. You lost that right when you killed my boy. The words hit Ezra like physical blows, driving the breath from his lungs. Around them, the watching townsfolk stirred uneasily. He saw Mrs. Peterson retreat into her store, probably to fetch her husband. Across the street, he recognized the solid figure of Tom Bradford, the unofficial leader of the town council, stepping out of the bank with a frown creasing his weathered features. I never killed anyone, Ezra said, keeping his voice level despite the pain that Marcus's words had awakened. And you know it. Same as if you had. Marcus shot back. Your greed, your schemes, your get-rich-quick partnership with Henry Carlisle. That's what put my David in harm's way. That's what got him shot down like a dog in the street. The memories came flooding back then, as they did in his nightmares. The mining venture that had seemed so promising, the partnership with Henry Carlisle that had seemed like a path to security for his family, the gradual realization that Carlisle was using their operation to launder money for dangerous men. By the time Samuel Reed had understood what he'd gotten involved in, it was too late. Carlisle's associates had decided that witnesses were a liability, and they'd moved to eliminate everyone connected to the operation. Samuel's wife and daughter had died in a fire that was no accident. Marcus Wade's son David, who'd invested his life savings in the mining venture, had been gunned down outside the Cheyenne courthouse where he'd gone to meet with federal marshals. Samuel himself had survived only because a friend had warned him to run, and run he had, but not before liquidating every asset he could reach and putting the money where the killers couldn't find it. The money sat in that Cheyenne bank still untouched. Blood money, Samuel had called it, though he'd never taken a cent that wasn't legally his. But legality and morality weren't always the same thing, and he'd carried the weight of that knowledge into his new life as Ezra Collins. I lost everything too, Marcus, Ezra said quietly. Mary and little Catherine. Don't. Marcus's voice was raw. Don't you dare say their names. You had a choice, Samuel. You could have walked away from Carlisle when things got ugly, but you stayed for the money, and good people died for it. I stayed because I was a fool, Ezra replied, because I trusted the wrong man and thought I could make things right. If I could trade places with David, with Mary, with Catherine, God knows I would. He meant it. In the 2 years since he'd come to Clarkford, not a day had passed that he hadn't wished things had gone differently. The guilt was a constant companion, heavier than his empty pockets, more persistent than hunger. It had driven him to this life of deliberate poverty and anonymous giving, this attempt to balance scales that could never truly be balanced. Marcus studied his face, and for a moment, something like uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Then his expression hardened again. Pretty words, Samuel, but words don't bring back the dead. A new voice cut through the tension. You gentlemen having some kind of problem here? Tom Bradford had crossed the street, and with him came Bill Peterson from the mercantile and 2 other men Ezra recognized as members of the town council. They approached with the careful neutrality of men who'd learned to handle trouble before it could spread. But there was something protective in the way they positioned themselves, not between Ezra and Marcus exactly, but close enough to intervene if necessary. It struck Ezra as oddly touching. These men barely knew him, but they'd seen him work honestly for months, seen him help their neighbors without asking for thanks, and that was enough to earn their intervention. He found himself grateful and ashamed in equal measure. No problem here, Mr. Bradford, Marcus said carefully. He was outnumbered and on unfamiliar ground, and he was smart enough to recognize it. Just having a conversation with an old friend. Bradford's eyes moved between them, taking the tension. The rigid set of Marcus's shoulders. The way Ezra held himself like a man bracing for a blow. That's so? Well, Ezra here's been a good neighbor to us. I'd hate to see anyone give him trouble. Ezra, is it? Marcus smiled thinly. Well, Mr. Bradford, did your good neighbor tell you about his past? About the people who died because of his business partnerships? Bradford's expression didn't change, but Ezra felt the shift in the other men, the way doubt crept into their postures. It was starting. Then, the unraveling of the quiet life he'd built here. Soon they'd know who he really was, what he'd been involved in, and the kindness they'd shown him would turn to suspicion and rejection. Perhaps it was what he deserved. Can't say he has, Bradford replied evenly. But I know what I've seen of him here in Clarkford. Man's actions speak louder than old stories, don't they? Marcus's jaw tightened. Sometimes old stories matter, Mr. Bradford. Sometimes a man's past catches up with him, whether he wants it to or not. Before anyone could respond, a new sound cut through the morning air. The rapid clatter of hoofbeats and the creak of a wagon being driven hard. They all turned to see a buckboard racing into town, the driver whipping his team with desperate urgency. As the wagon drew closer, Ezra recognized Jake Martinez, son of the widow Martinez, whose firewood he'd split through the winter. The wagon slewed to a stop in a cloud of dust, and Jake leaped down, his face pale with fear. Mr. Bradford, anyone, you gotta help us. They took Elena. Bradford stepped forward immediately. Slow down, son. Who took her? Raiders, Jake gasped, fighting for breath. 4 men, maybe 5, came to the house this morning looking for money, food, whatever they could find. When Mama told them we didn't have nothing, his voice broke. They took my little sister, said they'd be back for payment, or Elena would pay the price. A cold fist closed around Ezra's heart. He knew Elena Martinez, a bright-eyed girl of perhaps 8 years, quick to smile and quicker to help her mother with chores around their small homestead. The thought of her in the hands of desperate men made his blood run cold. Which way did they go? Bradford was asking, his voice sharp with authority. North toward the high country, Jake replied. But Mr. Bradford, they said if anyone follows them, they'll hurt her worse. Marcus had been listening to this exchange with growing interest, and now he spoke up. Raiders, you say? How many men you got here who can ride and shoot? Bradford's mouth was a grim line. Not enough. Most of our young men are out on the spring drives. Won't be back for weeks. We got maybe 6, 7 men who could make the ride, and that's not near enough to take on a gang of desperate raiders. What about the law? Jake asked desperately. Sheriff's in the county seat 40 miles south, Peterson said quietly. Be 3 days before he could get here with a posse, and by then, he didn't need to finish. They all knew what happened to children taken by raiders. Sometimes ransom was paid and the child returned. Sometimes the child was never seen again. Sometimes the child was found, but in a condition that haunted the finders for the rest of their lives. Ezra felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He'd spent 2 years in Clarkford learning to care about these people, accepting their small kindnesses, finding purpose in helping them however he could. The widow Martinez had been one of the first to offer him work, and Elena had always greeted him with a shy smile when he came to split wood or mend fences. He couldn't stand by and do nothing while she suffered for others' greed. But acting meant revealing things about himself that he'd hoped to keep buried. It meant showing skills and knowledge that Ezra Collins, simple drifter and odd-job man, shouldn't possess. It meant risking exposure of his true identity. And with Marcus Wade standing 10 feet away, that could lead to complications beyond imagining. Still, when he looked at Jake Martinez's desperate face, the choice seemed clear. I'll go, he said quietly. Every eye turned to him. Bradford shook his head immediately. Appreciate the offer, Ezra, but this is dangerous work. These aren't just rustlers or petty thieves. They're men desperate enough to steal children. You don't have the experience for this kind of trouble. Maybe I have more experience than you think, Ezra replied. Marcus was watching him with sharp interest now, and Ezra could almost see the calculations running behind his eyes. Samuel Reed had been many things, but he'd never been a coward or a man to shirk responsibility when innocents were threatened. This offer to ride after armed raiders was exactly the kind of thing Samuel Reed would have done. What kind of experience? Bradford asked. Ezra hesitated. Once he answered that question, there would be no going back. The simple life he'd built in Clarkford would be over, one way or another. But Elena Martinez was somewhere in the mountains with men who might do anything to her, and that mattered more than his own secrets. I served in the war, he said finally. Cavalry. Saw action in the campaigns against Quantrill's raiders and other irregulars. I know how these men think, how they move, where they're likely to hole up. It was true, though it was only part of the truth. Samuel Reed had indeed served with distinction in the cavalry during the final years of the war, and the skills he'd learned there had served him well in the rough-and-tumble business world he'd entered afterward. But that military service was part of a past he'd hoped to leave buried. Bradford studied him with new interest. That so? Well, that changes things some. But it's still just you and me, and maybe 4 other men against a gang of raiders on ground they know better than we do. I'll go too, Marcus said suddenly. Everyone turned to stare at him. He stood with his hand resting on his gun, but his expression unreadable. You heard what the boy said. They're short-handed here. I got nothing pressing, and I know my way around a fight. Ezra felt his stomach tighten. The last thing he needed was Marcus Wade riding alongside him, watching his every move, waiting for confirmation that Ezra Collins was really Samuel Reed. But before he could object, Bradford was nodding. We can use every gun we can get, Bradford said grimly. You willing to follow orders and work with the rest of us? Long as the orders make sense, Marcus replied. And long as the goal is getting that little girl back safe. Jake Martinez looked between them all with desperate hope. You really think you can find her? You think you can bring Elena home? Bradford's weathered face was grim but determined. We'll find her, son, and we'll bring her back. Ezra nodded his agreement, though inwardly he wondered what price he might pay for this promise. Marcus Wade was already suspicious, and a rescue mission would put them in close quarters for days, maybe weeks. The chances of keeping his true identity secret under those conditions were slim. But as he thought of Elena Martinez, bright-eyed, trusting, probably terrified beyond imagining, he found he didn't care about the consequences. Some things mattered more than self-preservation, and protecting innocent children was one of them. We'll need supplies, he said, already shifting into the planning mode that had served him well in the war. Food for a week, ammunition, medical supplies in case someone gets hurt. And we'll need to move fast. Every hour we delay gives them more time to disappear into the high country. I'll see to the supplies, Peterson said immediately. No charge, this is town business now. And I'll round up the other men, Bradford added. We can be ready to ride within the hour. As the men dispersed to make preparations, Ezra found himself alone with Marcus Wade. The stranger, though he wasn't really a stranger at all, studied him with those burning eyes. Interesting, Marcus said quietly. Man changes his name, changes his whole life, but he can't change what's inside. You're still the same Samuel Reed who thinks he can fix everything, save everyone, make up for past mistakes. Maybe, Ezra replied, but Elena Martinez never hurt anyone. Whatever happened between us, she doesn't deserve to pay for it. Marcus nodded slowly. On that, at least, we agree. But this doesn't change anything between us, Samuel. When that little girl is safe, you and I still have business to finish. I know, Ezra said simply, but first things first. As Marcus walked away to see to his horse and gear, Ezra stood alone on the wooden sidewalk where this confrontation had begun. Around him, the town of Clarkford was mobilizing with the quiet efficiency of frontier people who understood that survival sometimes demanded rapid action. Men emerged from houses and businesses carrying rifles and saddlebags, their faces set with grim determination. Mrs. Peterson appeared at his elbow, pressing a cloth bundle into his hands. "Coffee and biscuits," she said quietly, "for the trail." "Thank you, ma'am," he replied, touched by the gesture. "But you don't need to." "Yes, I do," she interrupted. "That little girl matters to all of us, Ezra. And so do. Whatever that man thinks he knows about your past, I know what I've seen these past months. You're a good man, and good men deserve support when they're doing the Lord's work." She hurried away before he could respond, leaving him standing with the bundle of food and a tightness in his throat that had nothing to do with fear. These people had accepted him based on his actions, not his history. They trusted him enough to follow him into danger. The least he could do was prove worthy of that trust. The sun was climbing higher, burning off the morning chill, and promising another day of the changeable weather that marked early spring in the high country. Somewhere to the north, Elena Martinez was probably frightened and crying for her mother. Somewhere behind them, the widow Martinez was probably praying for her daughter's safe return. Ezra Collins, who had once been Samuel Reed and might yet become something else entirely, shouldered his rifle and went to prepare for the hardest ride of either life he'd lived. The past was catching up with him whether he wanted it to or not, but the future was still his to shape, one choice at a time. And his next choice was simple: bring Elena Martinez home safe, whatever the cost himself. The hunt was about to begin. The rescue party rode out of Clarkford as the sun climbed toward its zenith. 7 riders strong and grim with purpose. Tom Bradford led, his authority unquestioned despite his 50-odd years. Behind him rode Ezra and Marcus, maintaining a careful distance from each other, but united in their determination to find Elena Martinez. Bill Peterson brought up the rear alongside Doc Henley, the town's physician who'd insisted on coming despite his advancing age, and 2 younger men, Carl Morrison and Dutch Vanderberg, who'd proven themselves reliable in past troubles. The trail north led through rolling foothills that gradually gave way to steeper terrain, pine-covered slopes that could hide an army of raiders if a man knew where to look. Ezra rode with the easy seat of someone born to the saddle, his eyes constantly moving, reading the landscape with skills learned in war and honed by necessity. Beside him, Marcus Wade maintained his own vigilant watch, but Ezra could feel the man's attention shifting to him regularly, studying, measuring, confirming suspicions. They followed the raiders' trail easily enough at first. The kidnappers had made no effort to hide their passage, confident perhaps that no pursuit would come quickly enough to matter. Boot prints and horse droppings marked their route, along with the occasional broken branch where someone had ridden carelessly through thick brush. But as the hours wore on and the terrain grew more difficult, the signs became harder to read. It was Ezra who noticed when the trail began to split. "Hold up," he called, raising his hand. The party reined in, horses snorting and stamping in the thin mountain air. Ezra dismounted and knelt beside what looked like a game trail branching off from the main path. His fingers traced marks in the soft earth, his expression growing troubled. "What is it?" Bradford asked, swinging down from his own mount. "They split up here," Ezra replied, pointing to the confused welter of tracks. "Looks like 2 men went that way." He indicated the main trail continuing north, and 3 went up this side path with the girl. Marcus dismounted as well, studying the ground with professional interest. "You sure about that?" Ezra nodded, pointing to specific marks in the dirt. "See here? Smaller horse, lighter load, probably Elena riding double with one of them. And here," he indicated another set of prints, someone leading a pack animal. "They're planning to hole up somewhere, not just keep running." Bradford frowned. "Makes sense. Split the pursuit. Make us choose which trail to follow. But which group has the girl?" "The smaller group," Ezra said, with certainty. "The ones who went up the side trail. Kidnappers always want to get their prize to safety quick as possible. The other 2 are probably decoys, meant to draw off most of any pursuit." Marcus was studying him with sharp interest again. "You seem mighty sure about how kidnappers think." "Learned a few things in the war," Ezra replied evenly. "Irregulars and raiders all use similar tactics." It was true, but incomplete. Samuel Reed had indeed fought against Confederate raiders and guerrillas, but he'd also learned about criminal thinking during his ill-fated partnership with Henry Carlisle. The mining venture had brought him into contact with men who lived outside the law, and he'd absorbed more about their methods than he'd ever wanted to know. So we followed the side trail, Peterson asked. Bradford nodded grimly. We stick together. Can't afford to split up. We're outnumbered as it is. They remounted and turned up the narrow game trail. Single file now as the path wound between tall pines and granite outcroppings. The going was slower here and more dangerous. A perfect place for an ambush if the raiders were minded to fight rather than run. Ezra found himself riding second in line behind Bradford, his rifle across his saddle bow and his nerves stretched tight with anticipation. The afternoon wore on, shadows lengthening as they climbed higher into country that grew increasingly wild and remote. They found signs of the raiders' passage. A broken twig here, a horse dropping there. But the trail was harder to follow now, winding through rocky terrain that revealed little. It was near evening when they caught their first glimpse of smoke. There, Bradford said quietly, pointing to a thin gray thread rising above the trees perhaps a mile ahead. Looks like they're making camp. Could be innocent travelers, Doc Henley offered hopefully. Could be, Ezra agreed, but not likely, not this far off the main trails. He studied the smoke's location, noting how it rose from what appeared to be a natural bowl in the mountains, protected on three sides by steep slopes. Good defensive position, water nearby probably, and only one way in or out. So how do we approach? Morrison asked. He was young, barely out of his teens, and the tension was telling on him. Ezra was quiet for a moment, thinking. In the war, he'd faced similar situations, entrenched enemies in strong positions, often with civilian hostages. The key was always patience and careful reconnaissance, understanding the enemy's strengths and weaknesses before committing to action. We wait for full dark, he said finally. Send one man up to scout their position. See how many we're facing and where they're keeping Elena. Then we decide whether to try talking them out or taking them by force. I'll do the scouting. Marcus volunteered immediately. Bradford shook his head. No offense, stranger, but I don't know your skills. This is delicate work. If you're spotted, the girl could pay the price. I'll go, Ezra said quietly. There was something in his tone that made everyone look at him. Marcus's eyes narrowed with suspicion, but Bradford nodded slowly. You sure about this? If they catch you? They won't, Ezra replied with quiet confidence. I know how to move quiet when I need to. As darkness settled over the mountains, Ezra prepared for the reconnaissance. He shed his jacket and anything else that might catch on brush or make noise, keeping only his knife and a small pistol. The others would wait here with the horses while he crept forward to assess the situation. Be careful, Peterson said quietly. That little girl's counting on us. Ezra nodded and melted into the darkness between the trees, moving with a silence that spoke of long practice. Behind him he heard Marcus's voice, low and speculative. Mighty interesting skills for a simple drifter. The approach took over an hour, working his way carefully through the forest toward the source of the smoke. The raiders had chosen their campsite well, a natural clearing beside a small stream, surrounded by trees and rocky slopes that would make a direct assault extremely difficult. But they'd also made the classic mistake of building their fire too large, and the flames destroyed their night vision while illuminating them clearly for anyone watching from the darkness. Ezra counted 5 men as expected, plus Elena Martinez huddled near the fire with her hand bound. The little girl appeared unharmed but terrified, her dark eyes wide with fear as she watched her captors. The raiders themselves were a rough bunch, bearded, dirty, armed with an assortment of weapons that suggested they were more desperate than professional. Their leader seemed to be a tall man with a prominent scar across his left cheek, who kept glancing nervously at the darkness beyond their fire. You sure nobody followed us? One of the raiders was asking. Relax, Scarface replied. Even if they did, they can't track us in the dark. Come morning, we'll send word to that Mexican woman. Tell her we want $50 and all the food she can spare, or the kid disappears permanent-like. $50? Another raider laughed. That widow ain't got 50 cents to her name. Then maybe the town will chip in, Scarface said with an ugly grin. Folks always get generous when it comes to saving children. Elena whimpered at this exchange, and one of the raiders cuffed her roughly. Shut up, kid. Your crying ain't gonna help nobody. Ezra's hands tightened into fists, but he forced himself to remain calm and observant. The raiders were positioned carelessly, too confident in their security, too focused on the fire and their own conversation. Two had rifles within easy reach. The others relied on pistols. Most importantly, Elena was sitting near the edge of the clearing, close enough to the tree-line that a quick dash might get her to safety. But 5 armed men were too many for one person to handle alone, even with the advantage of surprise. He'd need help, and that meant coordinating with the others. Ezra began his careful withdrawal, already planning the approach he'd recommend to Bradford. The return journey took even longer, as he moved with elaborate care to avoid making any sound that might alert the raiders to his presence. It was past midnight when he finally rejoined the waiting rescue party, who'd been growing increasingly anxious in his absence. Well, Bradford whispered. 5 men, just like we thought, Ezra reported quietly. They've got Elena near the fire, hands tied, but she looks unharmed. The camp's in a clearing beside a stream, maybe 200 yards ahead through thick timber. Can we take them? Morrison asked eagerly. Maybe, Ezra replied, but it'll be risky. They're in a strong position, and if shooting starts, the girl could get hurt. Marcus leaned forward intently. What do you recommend? Ezra was quiet for a moment, considering options. In his experience, the best solutions to hostage situations often involve dividing the enemy's attention, creating confusion that could be exploited by coordinated action. But that required precise timing and absolute trust between the rescue team members. Trust that might be difficult to achieve given Marcus's presence and suspicions. We wait until just before dawn, he said finally, when they're tired and their guard is down. 2 men create a distraction on the far side of camp. Maybe throw some rocks, make noise like someone's approaching from that direction. While they're focused on the distraction, the rest of us move in from the other side to get Elena. Sounds risky, Doc Henley murmured. Everything's risky now, Bradford replied grimly. Question is, what gives us the best chance of getting that little girl back alive? They spent the remaining hours before dawn in preparation, checking weapons and working out the details of their plan. Ezra found himself paired with Marcus for the initial approach. Bradford's decision, based on the assumption that the 2 men with military experience should work together. It was exactly what Ezra had hoped to avoid, but he couldn't object without raising more suspicions. As the first pale light began to touch the eastern sky, they moved into position. Morrison and Vanderberg circled wide to create the distraction, while Bradford, Peterson, and Doc Henley prepared to follow Ezra and Marcus into the camp once the diversion began. Ezra and Marcus crept through the pre-dawn darkness toward the raiders' clearing, moving with the careful coordination of men who understood the deadly importance of silence. Despite his suspicions about Ezra's identity, Marcus proved to be a competent partner. He moved quietly and followed signals without question, focused entirely on the mission at hand. They reached the edge of the clearing just as the first sounds of disturbance erupted from the far side of the camp. Morrison and Vanderberg were making enough noise to wake the dead, crashing through brush and shouting warnings about an approaching posse. The raiders leaped to their feet, grabbing weapons and peering into the darkness toward the source of the commotion. Must be 20 men at least, Scarface was saying, his voice tight with sudden fear. How they find us so fast? Maybe we should just run, one of the others suggested. Leave the kid and get out while we can. Hell no, Scarface snarled. That kid's our ticket out of this mess. Grab her. We're moving to higher ground. It was exactly what Ezra had feared might happen. Instead of investigating the distraction, the raiders were preparing to flee with Elena. In moments, they'd disappear into the high country, where tracking them would be nearly impossible. Without conscious thought, Ezra rose from concealment and stepped into the firelight, his rifle trained on Scarface. Nobody's going anywhere, he said quietly. The raider leader spun toward him, his own weapon coming up, but he was too slow. Ezra's rifle cracked, and Scarface pitched backward with a cry of pain, his gun flying from nerveless fingers. Around the camp, the other raiders were scrambling for cover and weapons. But Marcus had emerged from the other side of the clearing, his pistol already speaking. "Elena, get down," Ezra shouted. But the little girl was already throwing herself flat as bullets began to fly. What followed was a brief but vicious firefight, muzzle flashes lighting the clearing like lightning strikes. The raiders were desperate men with nothing to lose, but they were also confused and disorganized, unsure how many enemies they faced or where the next attack might come from. Bradford and the others charged into the camp from their concealed positions, adding their firepower to the assault. In less than 2 minutes, it was over. 3 of the raiders lay dead. Scarface was wounded and disarmed, and the 5th man had thrown down his weapon in surrender. Elena Martinez sat crying but unharmed beside the dying fire, her bonds already cut by Doc Henley's gentle hands. "You're safe now, sweetheart," the doctor was saying as he examined her for injuries. "We're going to take you home to your mama." Ezra stood over the wounded Scarface, his rifle ready but no longer needed. The raider leader was clutching his shoulder where Ezra's bullet had taken him, his face pale with shock and pain. "Should have taken the money and run," Ezra said quietly. "Children aren't bargaining chips." Scarface glared up at him through pain-glazed eyes. "Who the hell are you, mister? You ain't no town sheriff." "Just a man who doesn't like seeing innocents hurt," Ezra replied. But Marcus Wade was studying him with an expression of growing certainty. The way Ezra had moved, the precision of his shooting, the tactical thinking he displayed. All of it confirmed what Marcus had already suspected. "Samuel Reed," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "Knew it was you the moment you stepped into that firelight. Same way you always moved when trouble started, like you own the whole damn world." The words fell into the clearing like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the other rescue party members. Bradford looked between them with confusion, while Peterson and the others struggled to understand what they were hearing. "Samuel Reed?" Bradford repeated. "But you said your name was Ezra Collins." Ezra felt the weight of all their eyes on him, saw the confusion and beginning suspicion in faces that had shown him nothing but kindness for months. The moment he dreaded had finally arrived, the moment when his carefully constructed new life would come crashing down around him. "It is," he said quietly. "Ezra Collins is who I am now. Samuel Reed is who I used to be. And who used to be got my son killed," Marcus said, his voice thick with old pain and fresh anger. "Got a lot of good people killed." Elena had stopped crying and was watching this exchange with the wide-eyed attention of a child who sensed that something important was happening, even if she didn't understand what. Doc Henley kept a protective arm around her, but his own expression was troubled as he looked at Ezra with new uncertainty. "Someone want to explain what's going on here?" Bradford demanded. Marcus never took his eyes off Ezra. "Your helpful neighbor there used to be a rich man in Cheyenne. Got involved with some bad people in a mining venture that went sour. When the shooting started, good folks died while Samuel Reed disappeared with all the money." "That's not how it happened," Ezra said quietly. But he could see the doubt creeping into Bradford's weathered features, the way the other men were beginning to look at him differently. "Isn't it?" Marcus challenged. "Tell me, Samuel, what happened to all that money from the mining partnership? Where'd it go when you decided to play dead and start over?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, acutely aware that his answer would determine how these people saw him, whether they continued to trust him or began to view him as a threat. The truth was complicated, and truth often mattered less than perception. "The money's still there," he said finally, "in a bank in Cheyenne. Hasn't been touched since I put it there 2 years ago." "Why not?" Peterson asked, genuinely puzzled. "If it's your money legally." "Because it's blood money," Ezra replied simply. "Every dollar of it earned while good people died because of my poor judgment and misplaced trust. I'd rather starve than profit from it." There was something in his voice of bone-deep weariness and self-recrimination that gave even Marcus pause. Bradford studied him with the sharp eyes of a man who'd learned to judge character quickly and accurately. So you came here and what? Decided to live poor to punish yourself. Decided to try to do some good, Ezra corrected. To help people instead of hurting them. To find out if a man can change who he is by changing how he lives. Pretty words, Marcus said. But there was less venom in his voice now. But they don't bring back the dead. No, Ezra agreed. Nothing brings back the dead. But maybe the living can still be helped. Elena had been listening to all this with the solemn attention of a child. And now she spoke up in a small but clear voice. Are you still Ezra? The man who brings Mama firewood. All eyes turned to her, and Ezra felt his throat tighten. In her simple question lay the heart of everything he'd been trying to figure out for 2 years. Whether man could truly change, whether past sins could be balanced by present good works, whether redemption was possible for someone who'd made choices that got innocent people killed. Yes, he said quietly. I'm still Ezra. Then it doesn't matter what your name used to be, Elena said with the absolute certainty of childhood. Names don't change what's in here. She placed her small hand over her heart. The clearing fell silent except for the crackling of the dying fire and the groans of the wounded raider. Dawn was breaking now, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. And somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark was singing its liquid song of morning. Bradford cleared his throat. Well, he said finally, I reckon we best get this little girl home to her mother. Questions about names and past deeds can wait. They bound the wounded raider and prepared for the journey back to Clarkford. But Ezra knew that his time of hiding was over. Marcus Wade would make sure of that, and even if the townspeople accepted his explanation, his presence would always be a reminder of violence and death. The peaceful life he'd built as Ezra Collins was finished. But as they rode down from the mountains with Elena Martinez safe among them, Ezra found he could accept that price. Some things mattered more than personal peace, and protecting innocence was one of them. Whatever came next, at least one little girl would grow up safe because he'd been willing to step forward when courage was needed. The summer of his new life was ending, but perhaps autumn would bring its own kind of harvest. The return to Clarkford was a journey of 2 days that felt like a lifetime. Elena Martinez rode double with Doc Henley, chattering about her adventure with the resilience of childhood, while the wounded raider was transported in an improvised travois behind Dutch Vanderberg's horse. But the real tension rode between Ezra and the rest of the party, a careful distance that spoke of trust damaged and questions unanswered. Marcus Wade maintained his vigil, watching Ezra with the patience of a man who'd finally cornered his quarry and could afford to wait. The others, Bradford, Peterson, Morrison, were polite but reserved, processing the revelation that their helpful neighbor had once been someone entirely different. Only Elena seemed unchanged, offering Ezra shy smiles and sharing her dried fruit with him during their rest stops. When they crested the final hill overlooking Clarkford, the town spread below them in the golden light of late afternoon, Ezra felt a pang of loss that surprised him with its intensity. For more than a year, this had been home, the first real home he'd known since losing his family in Cheyenne. Now it felt like a place he was visiting, a life that belonged to someone else. The reunion between Elena and her mother was everything such moments should be. Tears and laughter and desperate embraces, while the widow Martinez thanked God and every member of the rescue party in rapid-fire Spanish and broken English. The celebration that followed drew half the town, with folks bringing food and drink to share in the joy of Elena's safe return. But even as the festivities swirled around him, Ezra felt himself becoming invisible again. Not the comfortable invisibility of a man content to work quietly in the background, but the cold isolation of someone marked as different, potentially dangerous. He saw it in the sideways glances, the conversations that paused when he approached, the way mothers unconsciously pulled their children a little closer when he passed. It was Mrs. Peterson who finally addressed the elephant in the room. She approached him as he stood alone near the edge of the celebration, watching Elena play with a group of other children in the dying light. Her weathered face was kind but troubled, and she carried herself with the careful dignity of a woman preparing to deliver difficult news. "Ezra," she said quietly. "Or should I say Mr. Reed?" "Ezra's fine, ma'am," he replied. "That's who I've been here, who I want to keep being." She nodded slowly. "Tom Bradford called a town meeting for tomorrow evening to discuss, to discuss your situation. There are folks with questions, concerns about having someone with your past living among us." He'd expected this, of course. The frontier was unforgiving toward deception, even deception born of shame and the desire to start over. Communities like Clarkford survived by trust, and that trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to repair. "I understand," he said simply. "Whatever the town decides, I'll abide by it. Will you?" Mrs. Peterson studied his face carefully. "Because running again isn't going to solve anything, Ezra. Whatever name you use, whatever town you settle in, the past has a way of following." Before he could respond, a new voice interrupted him. "Mrs. Peterson, I wonder if I might have a word with Ezra, with Mr. Reed." They turned to see a woman approaching through the gathering dusk, someone Ezra didn't recognize, though her clothes and bearing suggested she was from outside Clarkford. She was perhaps 30, with auburn hair pinned back in a practical style and intelligent green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Despite the traveled dust on her divided skirt and the weariness that marked her face, she moved with the confident grace of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations. "I'm Sarah Walsh," she said, extending her hand to Ezra. "I've traveled up from Cheyenne with some urgent business to discuss with you." Mrs. Peterson excused herself with obvious reluctance, leaving Ezra alone with this stranger who somehow knew who he really was. Marcus Wade had been watching from across the square, and now he began moving in their direction with purposeful strides. "Miss Walsh," Ezra said carefully, taking her offered hand, "I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage. I don't believe we've met." "We haven't," she agreed, "but I know quite a lot about you, Mr. Reed. I'm a federal marshal, and I've been investigating the Henry Carlisle case for the better part of 2 years." The words hit him like a physical blow. A federal marshal, which meant the law had finally caught up with the Carlisle affair, that the web of corruption and violence he'd tried so hard to escape was still very much alive. "I see," he said quietly. "Am I under arrest?" "That depends," Sarah Walsh replied, glancing around at the celebration continuing nearby. "Perhaps we could speak somewhere more private? This conversation involves matters of national security." Marcus Wade reached them before Ezra could respond. "Federal marshal, you said? Well, that's interesting timing. I've been telling folks here about Mr. Reed's involvement with known criminals, and now the law shows up." Sarah Walsh turned to study Marcus with cool professional interest. "And you are?" "Marcus Wade. David Wade was my son, killed because of this man's greed and poor judgment." Something flickered in the marshal's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or sympathy. "Mr. Wade, I'm familiar with your son's case. David was a brave man who tried to do the right thing. His testimony helped us understand the scope of Carlisle's operation." "Then you know this man's part in it," Marcus said, his voice tight with old pain. "You know he's as guilty as the rest of them." "Actually," Sarah Walsh said quietly, "I know quite a bit more than that, which is why I need to speak with Mr. Reed immediately." The marshal's tone brooked no argument, and after a moment's hesitation, Ezra led her toward the small cabin he'd been renting behind the blacksmith shop. Marcus followed despite not being invited, his hand resting on his gun, but in a gesture that had become habitual. The cabin was sparse, a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and little else. The possessions of a man who owned nothing and wanted to own nothing. Sarah Walsh looked around with the trained observation of a law officer, noting the absence of luxury or even basic comfort. "Interesting living situation for a man worth over $200,000, she observed. Ezra sat heavily in one of the chairs. "That money belongs to the dead. I won't touch it." "Noble sentiment," Marcus said harshly, "but it doesn't bring back the people who died earning it." Sarah Walsh remained standing, her marshal's badge catching the lamplight as she prepared to deliver whatever news had brought her to Clarkford. "Mr. Reed, I need you to understand something about the Carlisle case. Your former partner didn't just steal money or run illegal mining operations. He was using your partnership as a front for arms smuggling to Confederate holdouts and rogue Indian tribes. The people who died, your family, Mr. Wade's son, the others, they were killed to protect a conspiracy that threatened territorial security. The revelation hit Ezra like a sledgehammer. Arms smuggling, which meant treason, meant his innocent investment in a mining venture had been used to fund violence against the very government he'd served in the war. I didn't know, he said hoarsely. I swear to God, I had no idea what Carlisle was really doing. We know, Sarah Walsh said gently. We've been investigating for 2 years, following money trails and interrogating captured conspirators. Your name came up repeatedly, but always as an unwitting dupe, someone Carlisle used for legitimacy while keeping in the dark about the real operation. Marcus stared at her. You're saying he's innocent? I'm saying he's a victim, just like your son. The difference is Mr. Reed survived when the others didn't, and he's been carrying survivor's guilt ever since. Sarah Walsh pulled a folded document from her jacket. This is a federal pardon, Mr. Reed, signed by the territorial governor. It clears you of any criminal involvement in the Carlisle conspiracy. More than that, we need your help to finish what your family and Mr. Wade's son died for. Ezra looked up sharply. What do you mean? Carlisle's dead, killed by his own associates when he tried to double-cross them. But the conspiracy isn't finished. We've identified the ringleader, a man named Colonel James Morrison, who's been using stolen army weapons to arm hostile tribes along the territorial borders. He's planning something big, a coordinated uprising that could cost hundreds of lives. The name Morrison sent a chill through Ezra. Any relation to Carl Morrison, the young man who rode with us to rescue Elena? Sarah Walsh's expression grew grim. His uncle. And no, it's not a coincidence that you ended up in the same town as a Morrison family member. James Morrison has been tracking you, waiting for the right moment to eliminate the last witness to his operation. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Carl Morrison's eagerness to volunteer for the rescue mission, his nervous energy, the way he'd positioned himself to watch Ezra throughout their journey. The young man hadn't been motivated by heroism. He'd been gathering intelligence for his uncle. Where's Carl now? Ezra asked urgently. Before Sarah Walsh could answer, the sound of gunfire erupted from the town square. Not the celebratory shots that sometimes marked frontier festivities, but the rapid, purposeful firing of men in battle. Through the cabin's single window, they could see muzzle flashes lighting the darkness and people running for cover. Too late, the marshal said grimly, drawing her weapon. Morrison's made his move. They rushed outside to find Clarkford under attack. Armed men were firing from positions around the town square, pinning down the celebration's participants and driving them toward the church at the square's far end. It was a classic military maneuver. Herd your enemies into a confined space where they could be easily controlled or eliminated. How many? Marcus shouted over the gunfire. Dozen men, maybe more, Sarah Walsh replied, scanning the square with professional eyes. They've got a high ground and good positions. This was planned. Tom Bradford appeared out of the chaos, blood streaming from a scalp wound. Ezra, thank God. They're asking for you by name. Said they'll stop shooting if Samuel Reed gives himself up. No, Sarah Walsh said immediately. Mr. Reed is under federal protection. I won't allow. Her words were cut off by a new voice, amplified by a speaking trumpet and carrying clearly across the square. Samuel Reed, I know you're out there. Come forward and face justice for your crimes, or these people will pay the price. The voice belonged to Colonel James Morrison. Ezra could hear the military authority in it, the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Around the square, the townspeople huddled behind whatever cover they could find while Morrison's men maintained their positions. He's using them as human shields, Marcus said with disgust, going after innocent people to get to you. Ezra felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Once again, his past was endangering people who'd shown him kindness. Once again, his presence was bringing violence to a peaceful community. I have to go out there, he said quietly. Like hell, Sarah Walsh snapped. Morrison's a killer and a traitor. He'll shoot you down the moment you show yourself. Maybe, Ezra agreed. But if I don't, he'll start killing hostages. You think he won't? You think a man who arms rogue Indians against his own people will hesitate to murder civilians? Through the chaos of gunfire and shouting, a new sound reached them, the terrified crying of a child. Elena Martinez had been caught in the open when the shooting started, and now she was trapped behind an overturned wagon with bullets whining overhead. The sight of the little girl he'd risked everything to save now endangered again because of his presence broke something inside Ezra's chest. This was why he tried to disappear, why he'd chosen poverty and anonymity over his old life. Because everywhere Samuel Reed went, death followed. I'm going, he said simply, checking his pistol. Wait, Marcus said suddenly. You go out there alone, you're dead. But if we work together? Ezra looked at him in surprise. You're willing to help me? After everything? Marcus was quiet for a moment, his weathered face hard with thought. My boy died trying to stop these bastards. Maybe it's time I finished what he started. He turned to Sarah Walsh. What's the tactical situation, Marshal? She studied the square with professional assessment. They've got us pinned, but their position isn't perfect. If we could create a distraction, get some of their attention focused elsewhere. Like the rescue mission, Ezra said, understanding immediately. Same principle, divide their attention, then strike where they're weakest. A plan began to form, desperate and dangerous, but possibly their only chance. Sarah Walsh would circle around to the church and organize the townspeople for a coordinated breakout. Marcus and Bradford would create a diversion from the eastern side of the square, and Ezra would walk straight into Morrison's trap, but not as a helpless victim. This is insane, Sarah Walsh protested. Morrison will kill you the moment he sees you. Maybe, Ezra replied, but he wants to talk first, wants to gloat, to justify what he's doing. That might give us the opening we need. As they prepared to separate, Marcus caught Ezra's arm. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I believe what the marshal said about you being innocent, about Carlisle using you. Does it change anything? Ezra asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Change is everything, he said finally. My boy would want me to help you finish this. They dispersed into the darkness, each moving toward their assigned positions. Ezra worked his way toward the center of the square, his heart pounding, but his mind clear. This was familiar territory, the clarity that came in moments of mortal danger, when survival depended on split-second decisions and absolute commitment. He stepped into the open just as Elena's crying reached a crescendo of terror. Morrison, he called, his voice carrying clearly across the square. I'm here. Let the people go. The gunfire stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. In the sudden silence, Ezra could hear his own heartbeat, the whisper of wind through the pines, the soft sobbing of frightened children. Then footsteps approached from the darkness, measured, confident, the walk of a man who believed he held all the cards. Colonel James Morrison emerged from the shadows near the hotel, flanked by 2 armed men. He was tall and lean, with the erect bearing of a career soldier and eyes that held the cold calculation of a man who'd learned to view human life as a commodity to be spent for strategic advantage. Samuel Reed, Morrison said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. Or should I say, the famous Ezra Collins? Quite a performance you've been putting on here. The humble drifter, the repentant sinner seeking redemption through good works. I'm not performing anything, Ezra replied quietly. This is who I am now. Morrison laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Who you are is a witness to my business partnership with Henry Carlisle, a loose end that needs to be tied off. Carlisle's dead, Ezra said. Your secret died with him. Did it? Morrison's smile was cold. What about the federal marshal who rode into town this afternoon? What about the investigation she's been conducting? No, Mr. Reed, there are still too many people asking too many questions. Your death will send a message that some secrets are best left buried. Around the square, Ezra could see Morrison's men maintaining their positions, rifles trained on the civilian hostages. But he could also see Sarah Walsh moving carefully along the church's side wall, positioning herself for whatever came next. "You're a soldier," Ezra said, playing for time. "You swore an oath to protect this country. How do you justify arming its enemies?" "Justify?" Morrison's voice rose with sudden passion. "I spent 30 years fighting for this country, watching politicians in Washington get rich while soldiers died in foreign wars. The Indian uprising will clear out the weak settlements, make room for strong men who understand what it takes to build a real empire in this territory. By murdering innocent families? By eliminating the weak?" Morrison snapped. "Darwin's law, Mr. Reed. Only the strong survive. Only the ruthless prosper. Your former partner understood that. Too bad he wasn't ruthless enough to eliminate you when he had the chance." Elena's crying had stopped, and in the sudden silence, Ezra heard something that made his blood freeze. The distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked, very close to where the little girl was hiding. "Enough talk," Morrison said, raising his pistol. "Time to." The world exploded into motion. Marcus Wade's rifle cracked from somewhere in the darkness, and one of Morrison's flanking gunmen spun and fell. Sarah Walsh's voice rang out from near the church. "Federal Marshal, drop your weapons." But Morrison was already pulling his trigger, and Ezra felt the bullet tear through his side even as he drew his own weapon. The colonel was fast, professional, but he was also standing in the open while Ezra had the reflexes of a man who'd survived too many fights to count. Ezra's shot took Morrison center mass, spinning the colonel around and dropping him to his knees. But even as he fell, Morrison was bringing his gun up for a second shot. This one aimed not at Ezra, but at the overturned wagon where Elena Martinez was hiding. No, Ezra lunged forward, putting himself between Morrison's gun and the child just as the weapon fired again. The second bullet hit him high in the chest, driving him backward and filling his mouth with the taste of copper. But his own pistol spoke once more, and Colonel James Morrison pitched forward into the dust. His threat ended forever. The battle for Clarkford lasted only minutes more, caught between the marshal's organized townspeople and Marcus Wade's flanking attack. Morrison's remaining men quickly surrendered or fled into the darkness. By the time Doc Henley reached Ezra's side, the shooting was over and the immediate danger passed. "How bad?" Ezra asked, though the spreading warmth across his chest already told him the answer. Doc Henley's face was grim as he examined the wounds. "Bad enough. That second bullet's too close to your heart for me to dig out safely. I can make you comfortable, but I'm dying," Ezra finished for him. "I'm sorry," the doctor said simply. Word spread quickly through the town, and soon a crowd had gathered around the fallen man who'd saved them all. Elena Martinez broke free from her mother's protective embrace and knelt beside Ezra, her small hand finding his. "Are you going to be like the other angels?" she asked with a child's directness. Ezra managed a smile despite the pain. "I hope so, sweetheart. I surely hope so." Sarah Walsh appeared at his other side, her face tight with professional disappointment and personal grief. "The territory owes you a debt, Mr. Reed. Your actions tonight saved dozens of lives." "Just Ezra," he whispered. "Samuel Reed's been dead for 2 years. Ezra Collins is who I've been, who I want to be remembered as." Marcus Wade pushed through the crowd, his weathered face streaked with tears. "I was wrong about you," he said roughly. "My boy would be proud to know you finished what he started." Tom Bradford knelt beside the dying man who'd helped rescue Elena, who'd saved their town, who'd proven that redemption was possible even for those who'd lost everything. "Is there anything you want us to do, Ezra? Anyone you want us to contact?" Ezra thought of the money sitting untouched in that Cheyenne bank, the fortune that had cost so many lives, that had driven him into exile and obscurity. Perhaps it was time for that blood money to serve a purpose that honored the dead rather than perpetuating their sacrifice. "The money in Cheyenne," he said with effort. "Sarah can help you access it. Use it for the families who lost men tonight, for Elena's education, for anyone who needs it. Let it do some good at last." "We will," Bradford promised. "And we'll remember what you did here. How Ezra Collins saved our town and our children." As dawn broke over Clarkford, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Ezra Collins closed his eyes for the final time. Around him, the people he'd come to love mourned a man who'd proven that the past didn't have to define the future, that redemption was possible through sacrifice and service to others. The widow Martinez would tell her daughter stories about the gentleman who brought them firewood and gave his life to save her. Sarah Walsh would ensure that the official record showed Ezra Collins as a hero who died protecting innocent civilians. Marcus Wade would carry word to other towns about the man who'd chosen poverty and anonymity over wealth and status, who'd found his way back to honor through the hardest path possible. And in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Clarkford, a simple wooden cross would mark the grave of a man who'd learned that names might change, circumstances might alter, but the human heart, when guided by love and sacrifice, could transform even the darkest past into something worthy of remembrance. The generous heart that had beaten in Samuel Reed's chest, that had sustained Ezra Collins through 2 years of patient service, had finally found its rest. But the love it had given, the lives it had touched, the redemption it had achieved, these would endure long after the man himself had passed into legend. Winter would come again to the high country, but the warmth of one man's sacrifice would keep the fires of hope burning in Clarkford for generations to come.